Hey, and here we are in V42. I have to stop dressing up so much for you. Got my fancy sweatshirt on. In this video, we're going to look at chemical reactions and enzymes. Specifically, let's focus on these areas. What are the parts of a chemical reaction? What factors influence one? Why are enzymes necessary? How do enzymes facilitate chemical reactions? And what happens if an enzyme is missing or is defective? And there's my little cute thing, DJ enzymes are always breaking it down. Yeah, well, it's hard to find good enzyme cartoons these days. So let's consider what a chemical reaction is. For those of you who've had chemistry, you've looked at this in more detail than we're going to do here, but we should understand some basic elements or pieces of a chemical reaction. When we say a chemical reaction, what are we talking about? It's a process in which one set of substances called reactants is converted to a new set of substances called products. So these are the key terms, reactants and products. In theory, reactions are reversible. They can go either direction, but for now, we'll just assume that reactions occur going one side to the other. So reactants will undergo some kind of change. New bonds are formed or new bonds are broken, and we end up with something different called products. Here's just one example. Here's a methane, it's really a compound, a methane compound here, and we have oxygen molecules. If those are put together under the right conditions, notice what happens. The pieces here rearrange. So we get one carbon dioxide molecule. So here we have carbon and oxygen, and we get two water molecules. Now, for those of you who had some chemistry, know if we start counting up things, counting up carbons on this side and hydrogens and oxygens, we'll have the same number on the other side of carbons, oxygens, and hydrogens. We really can't destroy matter. We just kind of rearrange it. So if there's a chemical reaction, we're rearranging the bonds between elements. But it's important to focus on these terms, reactants and products, because you'll see this again through A and P. So we can look at a number of different kinds of chemical reactions, and we're going to touch on this briefly. There are reactions that are synthesis reactions. That is, you take little things and make a big thing from it. Here's an example. We have, let me grab my pen. Here we have amino acids. Okay, amino acids are building blocks for proteins. If we assemble those and kind of build them into this chain, this pearl necklace, if you will, we get one large protein molecule. That's a synthesis, and you probably know synthesis means to build. So these are synthesis reactions. Okay, and these reactions we can think of as being anabolic. Anabolic means to build. So whenever you hear the term anabolism or anabolic, it means you're taking small things to make a big thing. Another kind of reaction set, though, are called decomposition reactions. Lost my pen. Hang on. Decomposition reactions. Where is it? Decomposition reactions. I can't draw anymore for some reason. Never mind. Decomposition reactions are those reactions which bonds are broken from a big molecule to make small ones. Here you see an example of glycogen. Glycogen is a molecule that we use to store glucose. And if it's broken down, if we snap the bonds in between these glucose molecules, we get the individual molecules being released. Let's see if it's on here now. This is an example of a catabolic reaction. Catabolic, catabolism means to break down. When you digest your foods, you're actually catabolizing or breaking down your sandwich or your sugars into small molecules like glucose. One final set of reactions here, we'll look at our exchange reactions. Here's where you have bonds that are both made and broken. So over here we made bonds. Here we broke bonds. Here we're going to make and break bonds. Notice in this case we broke off a phosphate here, but we put a phosphate onto there. So these reactions can be thought of as both, hang on, wait for it, both anabolic and catabolic. So these are terms, again, that we use to describe whether we're building or we're breaking. We can also describe anabolic reactions as endergonic. That is, they require energy. to put together two of these amino acids together to build this bond. This one right here requires energy to be invested in that bond. Conversely, if we break a bond between two of these components, we're going to release energy. That's the point of catabolizing or digesting our food, is that this reaction is exergonic. It releases energy that we can use to do cell work. So I know we're looking at a lot of strange terms here, but when we're talking about chemical reactions, there's patterns. Synthesis to build, decomposition to break. Exchange reactions are both going to be building and breaking. The terms for these, anabolism and catabolism. And then if it's energy investing, as anabolic reactions are, that term is endergonic. If we're going to release energy, because whenever you see a bond, that represents some chemical energy. If you break that bond, you release the energy, and that is exergonic. So what are some of the factors that can influence the rate of chemical reactions? In other words, how fast do we break down, or let's say we're breaking down, that we break down reactants to form products. So how fast does that occur? Well, it can depend. Some things can affect the rate at which a large molecule breaks into small ones, for example, in a catabolic reaction. Temperature. Usually, the higher the temperature, the faster the reactions run. Molecules move at faster speeds when it's warmer, and therefore they may be more likely to break. So that could be one factor in the rate of chemical reaction. Another one is the concentration of the reactants. If you have lots of, let's say, component A and lots of component B, there's lots of chances for them to hit each other and react. But if you have a lot of A and only a little bit of B, then there's going to be fewer chances for those things to interact. So that's going to slow down a chemical reaction. Particle size. In general, smaller particles move faster, and therefore smaller particles tend to react at a faster rate. But the one I want to focus on here in particular are catalysts. If you have assisters, not sister like in a girl, assisters, if you have some facilitators, some things that are making reactions happen, these are called catalysts. Catalysts are going to be agents of change. They make things happen. And in particular in the body, we refer to these catalysts as enzymes. I don't know why that's the back. Hang on. Okay, so this is a little reminder to me. We don't heat up our body at very high temperatures like in an oven to break chemicals down when we digest our foods, right? Rather than heating ourselves up or moving around really, really fast, we actually use catalysts. We use enzymes to make reactions happen. So how do enzymes work? Let's look at the example up here. See if my marker is going to be back. Yay! Okay, so here's an enzyme. Okay, this is going to be a protein the body makes, and it's going to have a very particular shape to it here that can only connect with one other kind of molecule. In this case, we call it the substrate. So when the substrate binds to this part of the enzyme, it does so at what's called the active site. It's kind of like a lock and a key. The hole is the active site. So in this case, this substrate can fit directly on the enzyme, has this very tight binding, and because the enzyme is there and it's kind of pushing and pulling and twisting on the substrate, it's going to cause it, in this case, to break, and now we're going to have two separate products. Okay, is this an example of anabolism or catabolism? Hopefully you said catabolism, because this is going to be a breaking reaction. We're going to break one large thing to two small things. So some enzymes are involved in catabolism. I'm showing you here at the bottom here an example of anabolism. Here we have our substrates. Our initial reactants here are going to be amino acids. Here's an enzyme, and here's an active site. So it allows these two amino acids to fit directly in there. And you see they fit directly in that little complex there. We call this the enzyme substrate complex. They bind together very nicely. And then the enzyme kind of forces them together and kind of forces them to react. And in this case, energy is absorbed because energy is required to put things together. That bond is formed, and then water is released. The result is these things will now pull off of the enzyme, and now we have this. We have the product. The product is, in this case, a dipeptide, 2 amino acids, joined by a peptide bond. So let me get out of the way here. So the enzyme is going to release this, and we end up with the product. Hopefully you see in this case, if this is anabolic or catabolic, this is an anabolic reaction. The enzyme made it possible to form these two larger things from one larger thing rather from two smaller things. But again, notice what the enzyme does. The enzyme either helps pull things apart or push things together. It's a catalyst. It's making things happen that wouldn't ordinarily happen except maybe at higher temperatures. Okay, so hang on, here we go. So how do enzymes work? Enzymes do something called, they lower the activation energy for a reaction to happen. Don't stress about this too much except to understand what that concept means. Okay, activation energy is the energy required, in this case, to force two things together. These two things may be, let's say, inside of a cell, and they're both kind of moving kind of slowly, and the chance that one of them runs at the other one really hard and really fast is going to be kind of small on its own. So if it's really a steep curve like you're seeing here, it's probably not going to happen too easily, and therefore the reaction probably won't happen maybe at all. What enzymes do is, because they help force things together, they make that reaction required for them to collide less. They have to have less energy to do that. And so if you want to think of it this way, this bump's easier to get over and therefore more likely to have a reaction than this bump over here. So if you're a little confused what we're talking about, just focus on this one idea. Enzymes, being catalysts, make things happen that ordinarily would not happen, and they do so by lowering the energy required for a chemical reaction to occur. So briefly, and to wrap up here, what are some properties of enzymes? Enzymes are proteins, and we'll focus on this idea on the next video actually. Proteins have very particular shapes, and they have to have that shape so that they can bind directly to a substrate. But because they are proteins, they're sensitive to environmental conditions. If you heat up a protein, it can change. If the pH is wrong, the protein can change its shape and therefore break down and therefore not work. So enzymes have to have very particular pHs or very particular temperatures at which to work. And the example I gave you over here is showing you, okay, initial velocity of product. Okay, fancy way of saying how fast does the reaction happen. This reaction doesn't really happen very much at that down here between a pH of roughly 3.5 and 4.5. You see this is a pretty low reaction rate. This enzyme works really well, looks like at a pH around 4.8. But if the pH is much greater than that, much more basic than that, you see this enzyme doesn't work very well at all. So the moral of the story here is enzymes are affected by their environmental conditions. So that's why the body's pH has got to be just right wherever that enzyme is supposed to be working. Let me give you a quick example. The enzymes that work in your stomach are working at about a pH of 2. If you give them a pH of 3 or 4 or 5, they don't work nearly as well or not at all. Okay, enzymes are very specific, and that again is because of their particular shape. Lactase, that enzyme, only works on lactose. It only has the shape that allows those two things to fit. Lactase doesn't fit glucose. Lactase doesn't fit sucrose. So they are very, very specific. Enzymes are not used up in the reaction. If you go back, and I can't for some reason, if you go back to this diagram, notice this enzyme is not used up in the reaction. It doesn't change. So it can be used over and over and over again. Most enzymes end in A's. When you see A's on the end of a word like lactase, sucrase, lipase, maltase, dehydrogenase. Whenever you hear A's, that means that's an enzyme. And as I said before, what enzymes do is speed up the reaction. They lower the energy required, which makes the reaction more likely to happen. So, these enzymes, in summary, in red, really important, make reactions happen that would not necessarily happen, so they're critical for metabolism, critical for homeostasis. Read that, what you see there in red, over and over again, and you'll see why it's important. It's really important. But I want to end with this idea, what happens if you don't have an enzyme? Here is a particular pathway in the body, and it starts with phenylalanine. This is going to be an amino acid, and you see here, here's an A's, here's an A's, here's an A's. You see a lot of tyrosinase here. Okay, this particular enzyme is really important to convert tyrosine to dopa, and dopa to dopaquinone, etc., etc. Imagine this enzyme is not there. Then we don't go through these reactions. These don't happen fast enough without the enzyme. Well, this is the product you get from this reaction if you do have it. You get eumelanin. Melanin is what we associate with the color of our skin, or the color of our hair, or the color of our eyes. So if someone is born with a condition where they do not make sufficient amounts of tyrosinase, what condition do they end up with? Perhaps you're familiar with albinism. And I intentionally chose to show you these pictures. Here's someone of Asian descent. People of Asian descent, Caucasian descent, African American descent, any race can actually have albinism, which is a genetic disorder where you don't make tyrosinase, you don't make that enzyme. So when you get this stuff in your body and you try to, when you try to convert it to the next phase, you can't do it, and so you cannot ultimately make melanin, so your skin and your hair and your eyes are going to have very little pigment in it if you have albinism. You have albinism because you're lacking an enzyme. I want to show you one more example over here of Tay-Sachs disease. In Tay-Sachs disease, which we see in more in people of Eastern European Jewish descent, someone lacks this particular enzyme, beta-hexosaminidase A enzyme, big word. So this enzyme is required to remove sugar from certain lipids, and if you don't have that, then they build up in the lysosome, and this causes neurologic diseases and large head, and then people with Tay-Sachs usually die by about 4 or 5 or 6 years old. So again, it's a fatal disorder because you lack a particular enzyme. So in this video, really important, looking at chemical reactions and enzymes. To summarize quite succinctly, enzymes are so important because they make the chemical reactions for our metabolism and homeostasis happen that need to happen. If we don't have those, then we're going to have potential metabolic disorders like you see here. That wraps up V42. We're going to look at macromolecules in V43. Thanks.